Hello, I'm WAQAR RIZVI, and this is Scope. Members of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SAARC, have not gathered for a summit in years. The 2016 summit was indefinitely postponed when a number of countries pulled out. While SAARC was meant to be above bilateral issues, interstate tensions have unfortunately dominated. Nepal, the chair of SAARC, has now pushed for a summit to take place, arguing that dialogue is the only way out of any regional challenges. To discuss all of this a bit further, we're joined now by Ambassador Najamuddin Sheikh, who is a former ambassador, joining us from Karachi. We're also joined with Parul Chandra, who is a journalist, joining us from New Delhi. She's deputy editor at Strategic News International and has just interviewed, in fact, the Nepali foreign minister on this very topic. And we're also going to be joined by Mainali, who is a journalist, joining us from Kathmandu in Nepal. Thank you all for joining us. Parul, I'd like to start with you, if I may. You spoke to the Nepali foreign minister about his push for SAARC summit to take place. What more can you tell us about what he said?
WAQAR, the Nepali foreign minister seemed very keen that the task force has been renewed, and he in fact said that it should be revived. So he acknowledged that there are issues that India has as far as convening the summit is concerned. He said that as far as India is concerned, it wants Pakistan to act more on the terror front. And even so, he said that countries need to sit together and to negotiate in order to reach some kind of resolution on this matter.
Very well. Ambassador Sheikh, what do you make of that? Do you think that, the SAARC summit should take place, and what is the need for it at this time?
It has been recalled about what the Nepalese foreign minister had to say. I think one additional point that should be made is that SAARC was meant to also provide an opportunity for the leaders to go into a retreat and then talk about questions that were more political in nature, and therefore not necessarily part of the economic dialogue, which theoretically, economic dialogue and economic cooperation, which theoretically were the foundation for SAARC itself. So to say that we cannot go ahead until there is some progress by Pakistan on X, Y, or Z is wrong. The SAARC forum itself provides space for the Indian Prime Minister, for instance, to talk to his Pakistani counterpart and to tell him what their grievances are and what they think or should be the solution. These would not be formal talks in the sense that these are informal exchanges always, and they can help to set the ground for formal negotiations. And I think that is what the forum was intended for, and that is what the forum should be used for. Unfortunately, India has taken the view that since the question of terrorism has a resonance around the world, and since India is at this moment engaged in trying to suppress a wholly indigenous struggle in Kashmir, they don't want to let this terrorism issue go, and they want to keep emphasizing that dialogue with Pakistan is possible only if terrorism is stopped, and that in Kashmir there is no problem apart from the fact that there is terrorist infiltration from Pakistan side. Now, the evidence that is available in terms of the United Nations Human Commission's report or press reports by journalists based in Delhi, but much more neutral in their reporting in many of the Indian newspapers. Okay. And in fact, many of the Indian newspapers themselves have also conceded that infiltrators are a very small part of the indigenous struggle, if they exist at all. In fact, one report suggested that a total of 8 people could be said to be from across the line of control, but otherwise the struggle was only indigenous. Now, the problem is that Pakistan is faced with issues with regard to terrorism, not only emanating from India, but also emanating from FATF. And while its struggle against extremism and terrorism continues, and has had successes. I think there are certain specific issues which have not been addressed and which I hope will be addressed during the next few days.
Very well. Let me bring in Sushil as well, who's joining us from Nepal, and Kathmandu in Nepal, pardon me. Sushil, thanks for joining us here in the scope. What do you make, Sushil, of the Nepali foreign minister's desire for a SAARC summit to take place? We know that the secretariat of SAARC sits in Nepal itself, and that Nepal is, of course, the chair of SAARC.
Yeah, our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister already said that Nepal is press the Indian government or India to sit for the SAARC summit. Because if you are not sit for the dialogue, then why the differences between two countries will solve? And this is not only the issues of two countries. This is the issues of whole South Asian countries, SAARC countries.
Let me go to you, Parul, and ask you at this point in time, what are in fact the thoughts about having a SAARC summit there in India? Do you think that there is a realization that, as the Nepali foreign minister said, that the differences must be resolved through dialogue, and that countries need to sit face to face and discuss these things out, especially for regional stability and for the region to progress?
Well, WAQAR, I think that you don't need a SAARC summit for the two countries to talk. They can talk even otherwise. And secondly, as yes, we have a muscular government in place in India, so it is not really a government whom you would expect to take perhaps a more moderate stand. But certainly, I think the two countries do need to talk, and SAARC cannot be the only forum for them to talk.
But then, to be fair, Parul, because we're talking about the fact that that right now SAARC, the summit has not taken place. For example, in 2016, it did not take place because firstly India pulled out, and then other countries pulled out as well of attending that summit. And since then, we have not had the summit take place at all. Do you think that these sort of bilateral issues, if I may term them that, should overshadow all of SAARC?
I don't think it should really, but I see it very unlikely that the SAARC process will move ahead, because India has already decided that it's going to look at other fora to build connections and have engagement with other countries in the region. So as you see, India is pushing for BIMSTEC, which is a sub-regional grouping. It was almost dead for the last 2 decades. And then in India held in 2014, a BIMSTEC leaders retreat in Goa in India. And then last year you had the 4th BIMSTEC summit, which was held in Kathmandu, Nepal. So really, India is seeking to isolate Pakistan in the region by pushing ahead this grouping and not wanting to engage or take forward the SAARC process.
Ambassador Sheikh, I wonder what you make of that. Can Pakistan be sidelined as an important regional country? How will the region progress without Pakistan being involved in any such process?
Well, we've seen this happening over a period of time, that India has sought to establish regional arrangements, including most of the countries, member countries of SAARC, and to bypass Pakistan in this particular fashion in terms of advancing economic cooperation. The reality is, of course, that Pakistan's inclusion is absolutely necessary if India is to realize its economic goals. You can suggest that BIMSTEC is going to take care of the eastward movement, but India has a very important consideration in terms of Central Asia, and Central Asia is not going to be done through Chabahar. It has to be done through Pakistan and Afghanistan. And this is a realization that exists. I mean, there's been recent studies with regard to what can happen between India and Pakistan itself in terms of trade, with World Bank study suggesting that the potential between the two countries is some $37 billion worth of trade. Now, I think that that's slightly exaggerated, but it gives you an idea of the volume of economic benefit that can flow. And I think that is what, as the description went of a muscular Indian government in power, that muscular Indian government is also intent on establishing that it places great emphasis on economic development. And for that economic development, I think many Indian experts will tell you that it's necessary to have normal relations with Pakistan, normal economic, normal political relations with Pakistan, resolve the problems that exist between the two countries, and then allow them to move forward to realize the economic potential that exists. Central Asia is, frankly, a source of fossil fuel reserves and of electricity reserves, which can be of enormous benefit, not only to Pakistan, but also to India in terms of advancing their economic goals. So all reasoning for a government that is intent, as it should be, on the economic development and the economic betterment of its people, be it India or be it Pakistan, they have to look at things from a geo-economic rather than a geostrategic or policies to be followed.
Okay, and that's a very good point, Ambassador Sheikh, that you're making there, because I did in fact want to talk about the economy and the economic aspects as you've mentioned there. Sushil, I wanted to bring you in and ask you, Sushil, give us the Nepalese context and Nepal's point of view on how trade can increase amongst all these SAARC countries and how its economy can also do better if SAARC process was to move ahead.
If you are talking about the economic development in the region, then one cannot go ahead alone. So it has to go together. And without peace, the economic development will not achieve. And the peace will result if you sit on the table for the discussion of conflict area. So if people of Pakistan and India and Sri Lanka and Nepal go alone, then they will not reach. They will reach nowhere. So this is the motto of the SAARC also when it was established. That means it is necessary to hold the SAARC meeting anywhere in this member country.
All right, so let's go for a short break now. I'll ask all of our guests to stay with us. Viewers, stay with us. We'll continue this conversation after this break. Stay tuned. Thank you for staying with us, viewers, as we continue to take a look at the statement that the Nepalese foreign minister has made, pushing for a SAARC summit to take place, for regional issues to be discussed regionally between countries to come to peaceful resolutions and understandings. Let's discuss that further. We're still joined by Mainali, who is a journalist joining us from Kathmandu in Nepal. We're now joined as well by Majid Mehmood, who is a South Asian expert. He's joining us from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. We are also joined by Dr. Salma Malik, who is a South Asian expert as well. She's a professor of strategic studies at Quaid-e-Azam University, and she is also joining us from Islamabad. Thank you all for joining us. Majid, tell us about what you make of the fact that there has not been a SAARC summit since 2016, since India pulled out originally and other countries then followed it.
Yes, India, as you said, that it's pulled out, and I don't think so that it is unlikely that it would again resume its presence in the SAARC summit. Actually, the reason is that it's a power play. It's a regional geopolitical power play where India would like to dominate its neighbor, especially under the Modi regime. We have seen that in the 2016 SAARC summit that was to be scheduled held in Islamabad, what happened was that it was not only India that pulled out of the summit by making an excuse of so-called cross-border terrorism. It was actually India also actually pressurized other smaller nations of South Asia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and then eventually Sri Lanka also pulled out under the Indian pressure. So this is an Indian power play, and it's likely to continue next year as well.
All right, so Dr. Salma, what do you make of the role in the fact that SAARC summits have not been able to take place recently?
Consensus-based decision whether to hold the summit or not. So if one member pulls out,
Yeah.
Then the others, one after the other, pull out. And the entire spirit of SARC is as such that all have to represent. Secondly, the issue is that SARC, as you very well know, was created by the small powers of South Asia, minus Pakistan and India, primarily as a regional counterweight or a collective body that could be the effective voice and also kind of mute the acrimonious sounds that are coming from New Delhi or from Pakistan in retaliation to what New Delhi says.
Yeah.
And it was Bangladesh and Sri Lanka that had initiated such a regional initiative, and then of course Nepal becoming the depository or the headquarters of SARC. So it was to help serve the interest of smaller countries. And as we also look at the charter of SARC, SARC is such an organization which is to look at non-traditional security problems and not bilateral issues. But unfortunately, because India has always been that bully in the block, so they have managed to entirely erode this entire sentiment and the entire expression that SARC brings with it.
Yeah.
So that unfortunately becomes the tragedy.
Okay, so let me go to Nepal then. Sheikh, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Do you think that with this statement that the Nepalese foreign minister made about wanting SARC, Sushil, what do you think, Sushil, that means about Nepal's policies now? Is it now looking at these things independently of pressure from India, Sushil?
Yeah, it depends on the totally on the Indian government, because Nepal already is stated that some SAARC summit should be in the South Asia should meet together to go ahead. So all the Nepal and Nepali people always want SAARC summit to hold regularly in these regions for the economic development and the upliftment of the poor people in this region. So no doubt that Nepal and Nepali people are always on regular basis, not for the, it will not be worked by someone's ego to go ahead with this entire region. So, so that means Nepali are always in favor of the summit. And if you are not discussing each other idea and the economic status of the country, how the motto of the SAARC will be achieved. So we have to achieve the motto of the SAARC, why it established, and so many things behind this.
Okay, so all right, so let me bring you in, and then let's talk about the economic benefits that this region could be achieving at this point in time. We have the Asian Development Bank, Majid, saying that estimated inter-regional trade just within SAARC countries have a potential of being upwards of $22 billion. Currently, that trade stands at around $8 billion. Do you think that all of these bilateral tensions, especially, of course, what the Indians have done vis-a-vis SAARC, is holding this region back, right?
Yes, of course. As you mentioned, the figures of the inter-regional trade, and that is why, due to the political impediments and bilateral disputes, the South Asian states prefer to pursue their economic interests via bilateral engagements and bilateral treaties instead of SAARC. So, of course, there is a potential, because if you look at the market, the three most populous countries in the world, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, they are a huge market. And there are many areas that could be tapped in energy, infrastructure, non-traditional economic issues as the mandate of SAARC and other economic connectivity issues. But the SAARC has unfortunately failed to establish this South Asian connectivity, And if you see ASEAN, for instance, as an example of comparison, SAARC is nowhere in terms of regional economic connectivity and boosting the potential, the economic potential that exists in these markets.
Yeah.
So this is a major issue. But I think the political disputes are a major issue in this, and bilateral disputes in the region are major issues, not just India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
For instance, India's intervention in Sri Lanka in the late 1980s, that was also a major issue, and India continues to interfere in Bhutan and Nepal's political dynamics, internal political dynamics. So as long as this is a principle, understood in international relations, that as long as bilateral disputes will remain active, there is no way to circumvent the economic connectivity problem.
And Dr. Salma, I wonder where you make too, because from the Pakistani point of view, I imagine, Dr. Salma, that Pakistan would say that, listen, energy cooperation, for example, would be important for Pakistan within this entire region, within the SAARC member states, because, the SAARC Energy Center, in fact, is based in the Pakistani capital. Why is all of that possibility and potential being held back, do you think?
In terms of energy, what I would technically say is, you see, Nepal is a main source of a lot of water that is flowing into South Asia. Being a landlocked country and upper riparian state, Nepal has a lot of potential to generate energy, and a lot of that energy which is being generated is being given straight right into India. Plus the fact that Pakistan also has, if we look, we invert the prism, Pakistan has the potential to provide provide Nepal and other SAARC countries which are energy deficient with manpower, with knowledge-based research and development, and a lot of other factors which are coming with these new alternate energy options. And so long as SAARC remains restrictive, it cannot be a bilateral trade-off where both the parties end up benefiting from this. And this is the major hindrance, because Nepal is a country which, again, you see demographically, some of the areas in Nepal are more developed, more populous, rather overcrowded than other areas. And as there is a rapid urbanization going on, Nepal's energy needs are increasing. Likewise, so is the circumstances with Pakistan. And there have been in the past ventures where Pakistan and Nepal tried to enter into cooperative mechanisms. But unfortunately, because of the entire atmospherics and India's overbearing presence and the very fact that India does not want any other country in the region to work on a bilateral clause, whereas they themselves very strongly adhere to bilateralism and they really trump that card a lot. So those notions could not be exploited. Pakistan and Nepal had explored such opportunities in the 1980s, then later on as well. But unfortunately, Nepal has always seen the worst side of the stick when it comes to trying to decide something on its own. But this process needs to be strengthened. And unless and until it is strengthened, it will not be bilaterally beneficial to either of the parties, whether they're bigger parties or smaller parties. And India, sooner or later, has to realize that it cannot perform as an aspiring global power that it wants to be by disregarding the concerns and the genuine issues of the region and the smaller and the bigger countries that neighbor India. So they'll have to change their approach when it comes to these factors.
Very well. And Sushil, I wanted to get your view from Nepal then, Sushil. Tell us about what Nepal's point of view is then on the need for cooperation, for example, when it comes to energy or other such factors, such as trade as well, because we also have, in fact, the South Asia Free Trade Area, which was supposed to be in place since 2006, Sushil, but that has not even happened. What's your opinion on that, Sushil?
I think Nepal is in very crucial phase now, because it's in the process already established peace in the country, and now it has to go for the economic development. For that, the regional cooperation and especially cooperation between the neighboring countries is the most. In that Taking in mind that India is the fourth position in the world polluter and the global warming is going up day by day. So there is a huge chance of potential of clean energy in Nepal. So talking about the energy, we have to talk these issues more regionally, including China. That means if you have to go ahead for the economic development and to go as a developed country, we have to harness our hydropower, and we have to serve the market in the neighboring country. That means SAARC country is the major area for that. And people of Nepal are migrating in the foreign country day by day, and it has not stopped till now. But if we invest on the hydropower and then get more job opportunity to the Nepali people, then the economic development of country will go up, and it will not be in that position that Nepal could play a main role to develop renewable energy in this sector. So Nepal must have bridge between India and Pakistan and should force them to sit in the table and talk their differences and come on the same agenda for the development of South Asia.
Okay. All right, very well. We'll leave that as our final word. We appreciate all of our guests and the insight and analysis they provided on this very important topic. Let me thank them from the top down. Dr. Salma Malik was joining us from Islamabad. She's a South Asian expert, professor of strategic studies at Quaid-e-Azam University. We're joined by Majid Mehmood, who is a South Asian expert as well, joining us from Islamabad also. We had Mainali there speaking to us from Kathmandu in Nepal. He's a journalist. Earlier, we had Ambassador Najamuddin Sheikh speaking to us from Karachi, and we also had Parul Chandra, journalist from New Delhi. She is deputy editor at Strategic News International, and in fact, she interviewed the Nepalese foreign minister on this very topic. Now, viewers, as the Nepalese foreign minister there said, for any issues to be ever resolved in this region, there needs to be dialogue. And that dialogue has seemingly been stalled, mainly by India, really, when it comes to this SAARC process, by pulling out of that summit in 2016 and refusing to then attend any other summit or even discuss the possibility of any other summit. We'll have to wait and see, though, how and what kind of an effect this Nepalese foreign minister's statement will have on Indian willingness to sit around the table with all the SAARC member countries. Remember, this is not just a bilateral grouping. We'll wait and see, and we'll keep a very close eye on how that situation develops regarding SAARC. Thanks for watching this segment. Don't go anywhere, though. I'll be back after a break with our next segment. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in The Scope with me, WAQAR RIZVI. Now, the plan for how the United States will actually pull out from Syria remains a mystery as officials continue to contradict each other. Seemingly, Trump is going ahead nevertheless, with military equipment now slowly being moved to Iraq. Concerns among U.S. allies in the region about Russian and Iranian influence, as well as what will happen to U.S.-backed Kurds at the hands of Turkey, remain. To discuss all that a bit further, we're firstly joined by Mr. Dmitry Babich, who is a journalist, and he is joining us from the Russian capital, Moscow. Dmitry, as always, we appreciate you taking your time out and joining us here in The Scope. Dmitry, we had Maria Zakharova, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, talking about this U.S. military announcement to pull out, and she said, and I'm quoting her, that it seems like Washington is looking for a reason to stay. Do you agree with her?
Well, unfortunately, I would like to disagree with her, but it looks very much like what she's saying and what the Russian President Vladimir Putin said right before the new year. He refused to believe that the United States would just pull out simply because the elected president said so. The whole problem is that the United States is not governed by the elected president, by Mr. Trump. The United States is governed by a very radical, ultra-liberal ideology. This ideology was personified by Mr. Obama It was supposed to be personified after him by Hillary Clinton. She lost the election, but it doesn't mean that this ideology stopped governing the United States. It continues to govern the United States. And we see a very good example of this. The president says, I'm pulling out the troops out of Syria. Generals say, to hell with you. And the troops just stay. And the press is happy about it because, you know, the United States is ruled by this radical ideology mostly via the press and via the Washington establishment. And the press is just happy, forgetting about Vietnam, forgetting about the anti-war spirit. You know, it's just a militaristic doctrine that is, in fact, running the United States. I actually don't care anymore what Mr. Trump has to say. He doesn't govern the United States.
All right, so let's add another to this conversation. We're now joined with Setarch Sadeqi, who is a researcher. She's joining us from the Iranian capital, Tehran. She is a PhD candidate in American Studies and is also a freelance researcher. Setarch, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. Give us the point of view, if you can, Setarch, from where you are in Iran. Do you think that Iran also distrusts the U.S. president when he says he wants to pull out? Will the U.S. really pull out of Syria?
I think that's more like just another gesture by Trump to create some, you know, criticism within the media, as well as maybe shift some attention from Syria towards other parts of the Middle East, where Pompeo is right now taking a tour. I doubt Syria would fully, the U.S. would fully withdraw from Syria, because already Trump has changed what he initially stated, and instead of pulling immediately all the troops, they have started with the vehicles rather than the foot soldiers that are right now in Syria. Moreover, the U.S. is very unwilling to lose what is filled with Kurdish insurgents because they don't want to leave the space to Turkey or Iran. So the U.S. is still looking for curbing Iran's influence in the region, and for that matter, I don't think they will fully withdraw their troops from Syria.
And Dimitri, you know, obviously one of the major concerns, I imagine, on the part of the U.S. establishment is also, of course, Russian influence in Syria. Do you think the U.S. would ever be willing to take a step back and let Russia keep its influence as it currently stands in Syria?
Now, I think that this kind of argument is simply not viable from the legal point of view.
Okay.
The United States was not invited to Syria by anyone. You know, there are only two options how you can legally have your troops on the territory of a different country. Either the government of that country invites you to fight terrorists or to help in some kind of other emergency, or you are authorized to enter that country by the Security Council of the United Nations. Russia was invited by the Syrian government. The fact that this government is disliked by the European Union, by the United States, by Saudi Arabia, you know, this is, from a legal point of view, this is nothing, because Syria is a member of the United Nations. Syria has a government, and that government invited Russia. The United States is in Syria absolutely illegal. And when they say that they're there to limit Russian influence or Iranian influence or the influence of Hezbollah, from a legal point of view, this is pure aggression. The Syrian government decides whose influence it wants to have in Syria. It's none of the business of the United States or of the European Union or of Saudi Arabia, which partners the Syrian government chooses. As far as Israel's security is concerned, and this is the main kind of argument that the United States, cites.
Yeah.
Well, before the civil war in Syria, Israel was much safer. The Golan Heights, which Israel has been occupying since 1967, was a quiet backwater. Tourists were invited there from Jerusalem, from Tel Aviv. It was a safe place. It's not a safe place anymore. And unfortunately, Israel only has itself and the United States to blame for this, because the Syrian government, hostile as it was diplomatically to Israel, it never attacked the Israeli territory since 1973, while Israel occupied Lebanon in 1982, occupied the Golan Heights, or continues to occupy them, and now Israel is making airstrikes against the Syrian territory, airstrikes which are absolutely illegal from any point of view. Israel has no right to do what they're doing now with Syria.
Okay, so Pompeo going very harshly after Iran in Cairo. What do you make of his statements and why the U.S. is so worried about any Iranian presence in Syria?
Well, again, let's come back to the question, who is ruling the United States? Mr. Trump is not ruling the United States. It is clear from what happened in the last few weeks and months. Look, he wants to build the wall on the border with Mexico. If Mr. Obama said, I want to build a wall just, 3 years ago, the wall would be there, because Mr. Obama is a man of the ultra-liberal ideology. He is a globalist. He is their man. Mr. Trump represents a different ideology, and he is not ruling the United States. But there is one point where the ideology of Mr. Trump, which is just crude American nationalism, and the ideology of ultra-liberals coincide. And that point is their support for Israel and their distrust of Iran. Distrust of Iran and some other countries such as Russia, such as China. This distrust is not built on any rational kind of arguments, because modern Iran is very different from what it used to be under Ayatollah Khomeini. Modern Iran is not an aggressive state. It did not attack its neighbors. It did not help terrorist activities. On the contrary, Iran has been a victim of Al-Qaeda's attacks. Let me just cite the terrible explosion of the Iranian embassy in Lebanon, a lot of other terrorist acts committed against Iran. So when Mr. Pompeo is making his anti-Iranian overtures, he is trying to cater to the audience on both sides of the divide in the United States. He's catering to the ultra-liberals who hate Iran because it's not part of their global order, it's a challenge. And he caters to the American nationalists, people like Mr. Trump, who simply have it crammed into their hands that,
Okay,
Iran...
Dimitri, I'm just going to interrupt you. I apologize, because I do have Setarch back on with us from Tehran, and I wanted to get her point of view on this. Setarch, what do you make of Pompeo's anti-Iran statements? He also added on that, we must confront the Ayatollahs, not coddle them. And that, as I said earlier as well, that every last Iranian boot must be expelled from Syria. Those are very harsh statements, aren't they, Setarch?
Yeah. Yes, they are very harsh statements, but they're not unprecedented. And we have always heard those statements coming from U.S. politicians. But the thing is, as Dimitri also mentioned, the legitimacy of the Syrian government is defined by UN rules, laws. In no matter what the U.S. says, Iran and Russia have been present in Syria upon the invitation of the Syrian government, no matter whether the U.S. likes them or not. And the United States is the one who has been siding with the terrorist groups and organizations in Syria. So they might want to curb Iranian influence by calling them the terrorist or whatever they might, but there is evidence, there are facts supporting that it has been the United States who not only gave rise to ISIS in Syria, but also armed Al-Qaeda affiliates and the rebels who have been fighting against the Syrian nation, not just the Syrian government. So I don't think those statements really matter. Iran will continue to support Syria and other countries who have to, fight back with U.S. and Israeli-led rebels, whether it's in Syria or in other places. And let's not forget that it's been a severe defeat for the United States in Syria, although they like to take credit for the defeat of ISIS. There's evidence that it's been what Russia and Iran have been helping the Syrian government to achieve.
So, Setarch, let me ask you a very blunt question. What do you think the Iranian game plan is when it comes to Syria? Because as Dimitri mentioned earlier, for the American establishment, I should say, Israeli security is paramount. So any Iranian presence in Syria worries Israel, obviously, and we've already seen Israel carry out a number of airstrikes in Syria. But then on the other hand, we have an Iranian presence that is there. But then what do you think the Iranian game plan really is when it comes to Syria at this time?
As long as the Syrian government and the Iranian government are collaborating, they work together to, to protect the interest of the Syrian nation as well as the Iranian nation. So it's very obvious that Iran has been working with regional governments to counter Israeli aggression in the region, but it's always been with the collaboration of the legitimate governments, whether it's in Syria or in Lebanon. So I think there is not a major change in Iran's strategic approach towards Syria.
All right. So I'm going to put a comment to you then, Dimitri. Pompeo said, Dimitri, that the U.S. was a force for good. And then he added that where America retreats, chaos follows. We had the Iranian foreign minister obviously mocking that statement, saying that in fact, wherever the U.S. interferes, chaos, repression, and resentment follow. But do you think, Dimitri, that if the U.S. were to pull out completely of Syria, that would leave a worrying vacuum?
Well, it's clear that it is not leaving a vacuum, because as soon as the Americans just mentioned the possibility of them leaving Manbij and the Kurdish-held areas in the northeast of Syria, immediately the Kurdish militias said that they were ready to cooperate with the Syrian government army, and that they were ready to invite the Syrian government army to Manbij to protect them against whom? Against America's NATO ally, Turkey. I think the world community should not forget that basically the war in Syria was not started by Syrians. It was started by Islamists, with a lot of them foreign Islamists, with support from the United States and the European Union. And it was a huge mistake, because the result, even if we forget about the humanitarian side of the problem, about hundreds of thousands of people killed, which is, of course, the greatest misfortune. But even if we look at it cynically from the point of view of American and European strategic interests, security interests, it was a lose-lose war on all sides. The Americans and the Europeans did not make Syria their ally. They antagonized the Syrian population and the Syrian government. They lost a much more important ally than Syria could be. They lost Turkey, which had been totally loyal to them until the war in Syria. Yeah. They had an increase in terrorist activity, and they almost had a radical terrorist Islamist state on the territory of Syria, the so-called ISIS, so-called Islamic State. Islamic only in the name. In reality, of course, it was anti-Islamic. So basically, it was a lose-lose solution of Mr. Obama and Mrs. Clinton to move into Syria, to start all of this mess. And when they leave, the situation will only improve. The Kurds will coexist with the Syrians, just like with the Syrian Arabs, just like they did for centuries. Turkey hopefully will be wise enough not to destabilize Syria further.
Okay.
So I think it's time for Washington just to say, we messed it up, we made a huge mistake, we are not going to apologize because we are stupid radicals, but now goodbye, and let's see how Syria lives without us. I'm sure Syria will live much better than it does now without the American occupation.
All right, Dimitri, that was our final word. Of course, we appreciate you taking your time out and speaking to us there from Moscow. That was Dimitri Babich, journalist, speaking to us from the Russian capital. We were, of course, also joined by Setarch, sadeqi, and we appreciate her time and insight as well. She's a researcher who was joining us from the Iranian capital, Tehran. Viewers, as both of our guests there spoke about, the United States, in fact, is in Syria illegally. It does not have a mandate either by the Syrian government or the UN Security Council to be there. So any pullout at this point in time, as announced by Donald Trump, is, of course, the logical move, but it is the U.S. establishment, it's the military industrial complex that will really define what happens next vis-a-vis any U.S. pullout. Seemingly, some equipment is being removed from Syria at this time, military equipment that is, but we'll have to wait and see if the U.S. is really genuinely serious about pulling out. We'll keep a close eye on that situation there in Syria. But that's all for this edition of Scope. I've been WAQAR RIZVI.